What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. So I've gotten a few questions about how to learn CSS the right way, and I don't know that there's one way to learn it, but I do think there are some particular considerations for learning modern CSS in 2020, and I wanted to take you through a few strategies I have for doing so. You know, learning CSS can be tough, especially if you're coming from more of a programming background. It might not seem like it's as logical and consistent as something like JavaScript or another programming language, but I do think it has its own kind of consistency, and I think learning that can really help in addressing just how frustrating it can be. You know, like that Family Guy meme where you change one thing and it breaks somewhere else and you can't quite seem to get it right. I'm not going to dive as deep into that, but I do think there are a few things you can do when you're starting out and learning that are going to take you a really long way. So I have 4 techniques for learning modern CSS in 2020, and I'm going to take you through those now. First technique is called Know What's Possible. And so if you're just starting out and you haven't really done much CSS before, I think one of the biggest threats, if you will, is that you just don't know what you don't know. And a good way to take that on is to just learn what's possible. One way of doing that is by looking at a couple key websites, the first of which is called CSS Zen Garden. Now, CSS Zen Garden is a little bit of a throwback to kind of the Web 2.0 days, but I think it is excellent. The premise of the site is that you have the same HTML and you have a bunch of different web pages that have been styled with that HTML. And so you're just able to see how different a web page can look based on the styling, even if the HTML is the exact same. And so, for example, you have like a modern template and you have like a robotic template. And so it just kind of shows you what's possible in web design and with implementing CSS. And I think it's a great resource, and that's going to help you know what's possible. The next thing that's going to help you know what's possible is reading the documentation. And as boring as that is, I think reading the docs is probably the single biggest thing that helps you know what you don't know. And so if you just don't really know what's possible, you're not going to learn what's possible unless you encounter it in one way or another. And so I think that the documentation can be really helpful here. My go-to documentation for CSS is called MDN. That is the Mozilla Developer Network. And they have documentation for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but I would suggest just reading through the JavaScript. They have really nice examples, and just going down the properties that you can style and just seeing all that's possible with those. You don't necessarily have to do the whole thing, but I think it can be helpful to kind of just read down the list. You know, there's background color, which kind of sounds obvious. There's a lot of things that aren't so obvious, like opacity and more complex things like that. And so I think that can really help you know what's possible. As an addendum to this, I would suggest learning a couple key concepts, one of which is the CSS box model. Everything as far as CSS goes is basically a box, if you think about it that way. And once I really grasped this and kind of learned how content interacted on the page, I found that I had a much better grasp of what was going on and was able to predict what would happen a lot more easily. So that's technique number 1, know what's possible. Technique number 2 is learn from others. And so you may have heard in other domains or maybe with other programming languages that a great way of learning is to see how other people do it. And I think that is the case for CSS, but it's not quite as easy to go find really good examples of CSS. You know, I mentioned I had that question about what the proper way is. It's not quite as obvious because it's not quite as easy as going and finding a NPM module and seeing how the JavaScript is implemented. But I think one really rich foundation for really well implemented CSS can be site templates, assuming that they're good. And so my favorite resource for well-written site templates is called html5up.net. And HTML5up is from the creator of Card, AJLKN. And this guy, as far as I'm concerned, is a master of front-end development. And I find the templates really well written, and when I've used them in the past, I've learned just from seeing how he implemented things. So I would suggest just pulling down a free template from HTML5up and just seeing how it's implemented. And I think you can really learn a lot from seeing how other people do things. And let's say maybe you have a website you want to build, use the template, and as you're changing it for your own purposes, just make notes of how things are implemented. How were the base styles implemented? How were the breakpoints implemented? How did he or she use variables, which we'll get to a little bit later when we talk about preprocessors and all the other things? How did they make it reusable? Stuff like that. So I would just say go find really well-written site templates and just see how it's done. Another technique for learning from others is the View Source button on the console. This is how a lot of people got their start doing web design and front-end development. So if you have a website you really like or you think the design is really cool or impressive, I'd say check out the View Source and see if you can learn something. It might be a little bit more complicated because things have
gotten more complicated these days
as front-end development has grown in complexity, but you might still be able to find something cool. And that is learning from others. And after you know what's possible and you've learned from others, I think a good next step is actually implementing something and using a real-life workflow. And the best website I know of to do that is called frontendmentor.io. And the concept behind Frontend Mentor is that you essentially get these design challenges where you get, I think, a JPEG or something like that, and you can pay a little bit more money for the sketch files, but you basically have this design and your job is to go and implement it. And that is a lot like a real life workflow. It's a lot like what I do some of the time when I'm working on the front end, which is you have this design, you need to go implement it, and it needs to look the exact same as it does in the Figma or sketch file or on InVision or whatever it is. And so this is just a really great way of experiencing a real life workflow. And I'm also a really big proponent of learning by doing. And this way forces you to actually implement and use what you've learned as you've learned from other people and learn what's possible by looking at documentation and stuff like CSS Zen Garden. And so using this real life workflow really forces you to internalize and retain these concepts and really struggle with them. And it's not quite as easy as it looks maybe. And I think you just end up learning a lot more that way. And as a side benefit, you might end up with a few things that you could put on a portfolio as projects to show off. There are a few other ways of learning by doing. So you could go and find a favorite website and try and re-implement that or something of the sort. But I think just having a website like Frontend Mentor that already has all this set up for you is really good as well. And there's also a social element to it, which I think is pretty cool and could be motivating for you to just kind of keep pushing. After learning using a real workflow, I think the fourth and final step that I have for you is going to be learning modern CSS. And so you can do all the things that I just mentioned with just plain CSS, but you may or may not know that the past 5 or so years has seen a rise in kind of more complicated, but I think better ways of doing CSS. So you have the preprocessors like Sass or less, and then there's also been kind of the movement towards CSS in JS if you do something kind of like React or Vue. And that would be represented by something like style components, which I personally do at work and enjoy. And so I would just suggest going through the documentation on one of each. So I would suggest Sass for the preprocessor and style components for the CSS and JS solution, and just see how it's done. With Sass, the whole goal behind it is that you're able to extend CSS and make it more modular and maintainable using stuff like variables and mixins. Style components, the goal is kind of also to make your CSS more modular, but it kind of fits with the whole componentized way of doing markup and JavaScript together. And so you kind of have these neatly packaged little bundles, which I think is pretty cool and a fun way of doing it. But once you have the basics down, once you've gone through a real workflow, I think the logical next step is just to learn more about the way it's done in a modern web development environment. And if you want to do front-end development, I would say you pretty much need to know how to deal with a preprocessor. And so I would suggest, at the very minimum, Sass is a good first step for doing that. So that's it. Those are my 4 techniques for learning modern CSS in 2020. Let me know, did I miss anything? Would you add anything? Have you found something else to be helpful? So just leave me a comment if you have thoughts there and let me know. If you're still watching this far in the video, no pressure, but I'm assuming you found it helpful. I've noticed that a vast majority of the people that watch my videos aren't subscribed. And so assuming you're watching this far and you found the video helpful, I'd encourage you to consider subscribing. I'm going to be putting out a lot more content like this that is aimed at teaching people, aimed at making web development more accessible and just trying to be helpful. And so if that sounds like it is up your alley, then go ahead and consider giving a subscribe down below. Thanks so much for sticking with me this far. Hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.